with Rodney Sieh. Many of you may know. Hello and welcome to a special Focus on Africa Facebook Live. I'm Bolla Mosuro here in the Focus on Africa studios with Rodney Sieh. Many of you may know him because his name is one that's familiar to many Focus on Africa listeners, because he's reported for our program for many, many years, or at least he did. But Rodney is now an editor and has just brought out a book called Journalist on Trial, Fighting Corruption, a 5,000-year prison sentence in Liberia. Welcome, Rodney.
Thank you, Bolla.
And congratulations on your book, on the publishing of your book.
Thanks so much.
Now, we have you here in the studio because there are many people who want to know so many questions. And just in case you're watching us, not just listening to us, but watching, please do, at the bottom of the screen, put your questions, any questions you have for Rodney about his book or about his career. If it's not just about the book, please write them at the bottom. Please make sure you put your name and where you're texting from or writing from, so that I can put your questions directly to Rodney. So I'll kick off because there are a few questions already, Rodney.
Right.
With just asking, before I ask the listeners questions, tell us a bit more about the book. Before the sentence, when I read the book, it read less like memoirs or more of a mixture of your memoirs, your personal story, but also the story of your country. It's like you charted the very recent political history of your country with the civil wars, but also dating back to, if you like, Liberia's formation and how the press chronicled that journey. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I think so, Bolla. I think my goal and the goal of the publishers was to make sure that the book reflects and put Liberia in the context of the rest of the world. And I think I was able to go back into history because the current generation we have, they're very quick to forget. So sometimes it's good to remind them about where we come from. And in doing that, you have to put my story in the context, because I grew up in the era of the April 14, 1979 rice riots. I was a kid then, but I remember seeing hundreds of people in the street protesting because the price of rice had been, the progressives were demanding the price of rice to decrease. And Talbot, who was president at the time, William Talbot, he was caught between the rock and hard place because the progressives were after him. So I was a little boy then, growing up, watching my older friends and relatives in the street. You know, there were looters in the street. Some people die. And so I went through that violence. And a year later, in April 12, 1980, I saw when Samuel Doe seized power, and in April 12, 1980. So all those things, I think, needed to prepare me for where I am today. And I think I was meant to see those images, meant to see those things happening, in order to put my life into context. And
when you were talking about, it's very stark that right at the beginning you talk about your professional journey, because this, after all, is your memoirs,
right,
the challenges that you face as a journalist. And you talk about how the formations of you becoming a journalist started with an ancestor or a relative of yours, an old relative of yours, who himself was part of the formation of the free press in Liberia. Tell us a bit about him.
Yeah, my great-uncle Albert Port, he was a pioneering figure in Liberia, a crusader for justice, for journalism, and he was very vocal against the government of the day. And in fact, he was very fond of writing letters to President Tubman. In one of those letters, he questioned the president's reasoning for purchasing a yacht at a time when the country was in need of money.
A yacht?
Yeah. So, I mean, it was like, this is one of the most powerful exchanges in Liberia's history. And so one day I was in my aunt's house going through some paperwork. She told me to clean up her book. She has a book on the shelf. I was cleaning, and I saw this letter. And that's what I think led me to become a journalist. I was moved by the way he interacted with Tubman. And in many of my interactions, what people don't understand is that, because they have this thing that I'm an angry journalist, I'm always attacking the government. There were many cases in my profession where I have exchanges between me and President Salif. I don't publish, sometimes I publish some of the information that I have, if I publish them, there will be serious repercussions in the country. So sometimes for peace sake, you write them and say, this is happening. One of your ministers is involved in this X, Y, and Z. And sometimes she will take action, but when she doesn't take action, that's when we go heavy.
So you mean that, and we're jumping forward a few steps now, because you're talking about with the last government of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, you would say certain things to her so that she would rectify it before you put it in your paper?
Yeah, because sometimes it's very damaging, and people don't understand that even with the current government, there are things that I remember when the President Weah first took over. I know people keep asking me, why don't you help the government, improve and stuff? And I do try to help them. Like when he first took over, there was a case of there was report that his relative hired at the port, National Port Authority. So I contacted his press secretary and other people. I said, look, this is happening. Can you guys rectify this, or can you guys get us a response from the presidency? And they said, oh, we don't care. And so we broke the story. And so those things happen. It's not just Ellen government, this Weah government. It happens all the time. So we have to put these things to context, because people are quick to forget.
But to be fair, when you say these kind of things, I would assume that you stack up enough evidence first of all before you, like the allegation you just made about the president and families being accused of being, because that's effectively nepotism. Let's take it a few steps back, because people now have started with questions. The book, the subtitle of the book is Journalist on Trial, but Fighting Corruption, a 5,000-year prison sentence in Liberia, which you got. And Alex Malba says, why would the government sentence you simply for doing your job? So why did you get that 5,000-year sentence?
Well, when I was in America, Bolla, we exposed a lot of people. In the middle of 2008, I began to receive these emails from some people in Washington. At the time I was based in America, and they kept telling me, we have this, what if we gave you proof that the government of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was corrupt? Would you publish it? I said, sure, I will publish it. And I didn't hear from them again. And then they called back a month later with the same question. So I said, look, either you have something or you don't. Because my policy is every time you come to me with information, I ask you, do you have supporting documents? And
obviously you don't want to libel anybody, because we certainly don't want a court case on our hands here either.
So eventually they gave me a stash of emails. It was about maybe at least 500 emails. And I go through the emails, Bolla, I couldn't believe what I was seeing, what I was reading. Honestly, I thought the emails were fake. And it was not until I saw some information in the email, and I called someone who was mentioned in the email, and he told me, there was someone close to the president. He told me, he said, could you please hold it? I will see you when I return. For me, in the African context of that, it means they want a bribe. So I said that was my vindication. At the time, I had one laptop. I'm from Africa, just one laptop, one in my apartment in America, writing stories and, doing stuff. But that was for me, was the proof I needed to vindicate, to show that emails were authentic. And we hit those stories one after the other. I got threats of lawsuits from Washington, D.C. lawyers telling me if I publish, they're going to sue me. And I said,
and let's be sure here, what we're talking about is publishing in what was then an online newspaper, Frontline Africa, which is now, Front Page Africa, which is now a hard copy. You can now buy it in print. At the time, you were just an online newspaper based in America.
Yes.
How did a case that you opened, and we don't need to go into the intricacies of the case, even though Alex is clearly interested in how it then led to a 5,000-year sentence. How did you end up being sentenced back home in Liberia? When did you go back home, and how did that?
That's where I'm coming to. So when I got back to Liberia, there were so many scandals in those emails. So all the people that were involved in that scandal, because the criticism they have of me, they said I was in America criticizing the government. It got to me. So I said, okay, I'm going to go back home. So I quit my job in America. I was working for a newspaper there. And I moved back home to start the print edition of the paper. Once I landed Bolla, I became a target. They tried to burn my office down twice. They put fire bombs in gasoline in bottles and threw it in my office. and the fire started, and the people had to rush and cut the fire off.
These even threats to life as well.
Yeah, and then they started suing. I had about almost half a dozen lawsuits, and the first one it was very scary. It was about a rape case. A little girl was found; her body was found hanging in a shower, and they didn't know whether she was killed or she was suicide. So the Supreme Court was hearing the case, and there was a protest. So one of the readers at the court who were protesting said the court was biased in the case. So we published the commentary. And so the Supreme Court called me to explain why I published the commentary. In my effort to explain, they wouldn't give me a chance to explain. They said, "Oh, who are you? Are you a journalist? Where do you go to school?" So I said, "Mr. Chief Justice, without due respect, you called me to explain why I published this commentary. You wouldn't give me a chance to talk. I think you guys are behaving like dictators." And they held me in contempt.
Oh,
so
yeah.
That's when I went to prison for the first time. And it was on a Friday. On Monday, President Sieh was supposed to give us annual message. And in the speech she was about to give, she's going to say that since she became president, no journalists have been arrested. So they had to get another president before the Monday speech. So my lawyers, the president's lawyers, the Supreme Court lawyers were all going back and forth trying to sort this thing out until my lawyer said, "Look, you can apologize to the institution, but not the individuals." And that's what I did. And by 4
As in, you could apologize to the government?
The Supreme Court.
Okay,
that's
the Supreme Court.
But not the people who are there.
Okay.
And then by 4 o'clock that morning, I came out of prison. So it didn't take long after that, this 5,000 year thing started. And they're all trying to get at me. They want to shut the paper down, lock me up for good. But I'm here today.
Now, let's go back a little bit to talk about what you witnessed, because somebody has asked a question here about, it's Rebecca Mwanza, who said, "I met Rodney in London in 2015. We were undergoing the same training at the Centre for Investigative Journalism at London's Goldsmith University." And Rebecca says, "My question to you, Rodney, is, did you finally get to interview former Liberian President Charles Taylor?"
I've tried several times. The last time I was here, I tried to do it. A close former official of his arranged for the interview to happen. And the week the interview was supposed to take place, one of his lawyers committed suicide. So I didn't get to do that interview. I've been trying since then, but it's been very difficult.
Now, tell me how, when we're talking about Charles Taylor, how this impacted on you as a journalist, because I know you write about it quite poignantly in your book, when you detail how you witnessed certain things when the MPFL rode into Monrovia. What had happened prior to that, and what was the kind of impression that you had of people, and what did you see there that made you feel, this is something I want to write about, this is something I have to write about, that was part of your beginnings as a cub journalist?
I had a next door neighbor. His name was Henry Langford. He had just graduated from university with a degree in agriculture. When the rebels came in, they started killing people from few houses down below where we live. And we all watched from our windows and from our porches to see, as rebels, we got to call them at the time freedom fighters. They were coming. As they come, they take over the whole area. Why
were they seen as freedom fighters?
At the time, because everybody wanted to get rid of Samuel Doe. So the freedom fighters were Charles Taylor supporters, fighters who were fighting for his efforts. So when we saw them, the first time I saw someone die, I saw this guy with an M16 or AK-47, I can't remember, but he shot this pregnant woman. She belonged to a Crown tribe. And right then, everybody who was in that neighborhood, who were watching, they were stone cold, couldn't believe what was happening. And as they came toward us, a week later, my next door neighbors, his father was a security official, and we went to look for food, for rice, on a nearby area called Dupont Road. When we came back, an older lady told us, "Oh, they've shot your brother." And that was Henry Langford. He was just out of college, university.
And he was your school, an old friend?
And he died. And as we came to the house, I watched as the dogs were eating his body. During the war, that's what happened. When you die, there's no burial.
And apologies we should have given you a warning. Apologies to if you're hearing things that upset you.
Yeah, it was very moving for me, and I felt like I'm alive today because I'm supposed to tell this story. That's why I put it in the book, because all these things make me who I am and what I do. I'm not doing this thing because I hate any president or any minister in government. I'm doing it because I really want Liberia to change. We've been through so much over the last 100 years. So much has been happening in Liberia. Governments come, governments go, things never change. It's the same old thing. And I'm not a politician. I don't want to be in government. I just want to be someone who can put the government on the right track.
And in case you're just joining us, I'm Bolla Mosuro here in the Focus on Africa studios with a special Facebook Live with Rodney Sieh, the Liberian journalist and editor. His memoirs, his book is out. It's called Journalist on Trial, and details the challenges that you faced as a journalist, and also it details the political history of your country. If you have a question that you'd like to put to Rodney, we'd love to hear your questions. Please put your name and your question below, as you can see it on the screen, and I'll endeavor to read your questions out. There's another one here, which is from Nubia Rivera. And probably Nubia is writing this because a lot of what we see in your newspaper as the editor of Front Page Africa is usually some scandal or another happening in Liberia. I mean, at the present, we have the missing millions.
Right.
And it's not far from your front pages.
Right.
And Nubia asked a question: what is, in your opinion, the source of corruption that is the most difficult to eradicate, and why?
I think nowadays, and not just Liberia, everywhere I've been, I've seen this happening. I'm seeing a new pattern of sycophancy. It's like, the last president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, once said that it's difficult to fight corruption because everyone's related, everyone's connected. And I think the biggest fight media has now in fighting corruption is that if you start investigating one person, someone's related to that person, and they go after you on social media, they attack you verbally, throw things up and say things about you on social media. And that is an indirect threat against the journalist. So my thing is, if these people who are relatives to these people can tell them, you're in government, but watch what you do, watch what you say, watch how you move around, how you, because you don't want tomorrow you get in trouble and then the media has to report about you. So I think that's the biggest dangers we face today, because Liberia is a small country, less than about 4 million people. And everyone's interrelated somehow. And every now and then there's some connection. Maybe someone paying someone the school fees, someone doing stuff. So it's all connected.
So is it that because of that interconnectedness, that people are less willing to speak out, that almost censor themselves because they're scared about the repercussions on other people?
Yeah, I mean, if I tell you, Bolla, many times and people wonder how I get information all the time. I tell them, look, if someone believes in you and gives you a piece of information, what you do with that information will determine whether they'll come back to you next time with more information. And everyone who's given me an information, I've investigated and I've published. So they trust me, they believe in me, they come back all the time. That's my secret. But if I was suddenly giving something to publish and I don't publish it, they would think that I took money from somebody, or they would think I'm a corrupt journalist. So I have to report, I have to investigate thoroughly before I publish a story.
Somebody called Olusong Samuel asked, how do you rate the current president as far as social welfare and development are concerned?
I think President Weah has a very big agenda. He wants to pave all the roads in the southeast where he's from, and he wants to build a lot of infrastructures. I think he has a good intention. I'm just not sure whether they're going about it the right way. There's been a lot of talk about the efforts to get loans initially from countries that were not friendly to the World Bank and IMF. So that's been an issue for him. I think he means well. I think President Weah can succeed if he avoids the trappings of the previous governments of Charles Taylor, Samuel Doe, even Madame Sirleaf. I mean, her government was not flawless, and there were some flaws. Her Her weakness was corruption. She failed to fight corruption. She said it herself. And so I think if he can find the flaws in each of the past leaders and fine-tune his leadership to that, he'll be successful.
It's interesting that you talk about the links that previous governments have had with others that maybe ties them in, because Marco Lucetti asks, in your opinion, can George Weah change Liberia, and are African countries really independent?
I think any African leader can change their country. The most dangerous thing that has happened in Africa today is that there are too many sycophants that are putting poison in the minds of the presidents. And some of them are resistant to those sycophants. Like, for example, I know Paul Kagame has a problem in Rwanda, but he's doing some serious development there that people are taking notice of him. And it kind of overshadows the other things he's doing. There are people who don't want to see a Mugabe. They want to see, dictatorships in Africa. But I think if President Weah can play dumb to the sycophants, he'll be a very good leader.
Let me press on this issue of whether African countries are really independent, because an interesting thing you talk about in your book, when you talk about the political development of Liberia back in the day, when you were talking about prior to Charles Taylor coming to Monrovia, you spoke about the links he had with Muammar Gaddafi.
Right.
And you talked about the role of even countries like Blaise Compaoré and others. This kind of interdependence, do you still see it going on in 2018?
I think I always tell people, Bolla, I think if we had a Facebook, a Twitter in 1989, I don't think Liberia would have been as bad as it was. I say this because nowadays everything's in the open. I mean, nothing happens. I know it sounds funny, but sometimes about 50% of what you hear as gossip nowadays becomes true, because someone somewhere will put on Facebook or Twitter or something, and 9 out of 10 times it's true. So nothing.
As in, people aren't scared to expose.
Yes, people are not afraid anymore. So even if you gave something to that's what I tell my colleagues in the media: if someone gives information, you have to investigate it and publish it, because if you don't publish it, they have citizen journalists nowadays.
But that is key, isn't it?
Yeah.
The investigative part, because what so many presidents would say is, well, this is mere hearsay. This is fake news, to coin what Donald Trump likes to say. So how thorough do you have to be? How many sources? How many times do you need to hear it on the Twitterati? Because that's the danger sometimes, that it can be repeated so many times and you assume it's true. How thorough, how in-depth do you have to get with your investigation before it becomes the cover of your Front Page Africa newspaper?
I think one of the things that made Front Page Africa popular when we first started, we always accompanied our stories with background supporting documents. Everybody used to call it supporting documents. It was a link in the story that supports something. So that's our MO. That's what we strive for. We always ensure. And I get emails. I get about 50 emails every day with tips. I reply them. I say, do you have supporting document? Or I try to be friendly. I say, can you expand on what you're saying? If you can prove it, most times I won't carry it. I won't bother doing it.
And just in case you're wondering, I'm sitting in front of Rodney Sieh, who used to be a one-time journalist here on Focus on Africa and when we had Network Africa, and is now the editor of Front Page Africa in Liberia. And he's just published his memoirs called Journalist on Trial, detailing the 5,000-year sentence he received, but also talking about the challenges of being a journalist in Africa, in Liberia specifically. If you have a question, please do put it at the bottom of the screen with your name and where you're sending the message from, and we'll endeavour to read your comment. A couple more here. Asaba Formin asked, if you focus your investigative journalism on Liberia, or do you focus your investigative journalism on Liberia or cover other places, and why?
Sometimes we have situations where our investigations link to Sierra Leone or Guinea or Ghana most times. So what I do sometimes, I'll call a colleague in Ghana or Sierra Leone and say, what do you know about this thing? Once in a while I'll call Umar Fofana and ask him, what do you know about this, in Sierra Leone? And so I kind of like connect with other colleagues in the region to find out what's going on there. If I hear something about them and they hear something about me, they ask me questions, so vice versa. So we try to go, it's not just Liberia, but countries that are having these issues, we do with them all.
And it has to be fair to say, in your book, in your memoirs, you talk about how when you first started out as a reporter, it was on your uncle's paper.
Right.
And it was actually when you were in exile in Gambia. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, my mother was epileptic. You know, she had epilepsy. She was about maybe 19 years old, and she had a fall from a tree. And since then, she became epileptic. And so she couldn't move. So when the war came, I was taking her around in wheelbarrow up and down to different refugee camps. So when we went to the Gambia, and my uncle had started the Observer that was in Liberia, in the Gambia, because the war was in Liberia. So that's where I went and started helping him. And then there was a cricket tournament in next door Sierra Leone I went to cover. And I met Neil Corey. He was then the Network Africa editor. And he said, look, it's my card. You know, we go back to Gambia, get in touch with me. So this is a British guy who was in Gambia trying to do a racetrack. And I thought it was fun for Fast Track, BBC Fast Track then. So I filed a report.
Oh, sports.
Yeah, and then I started as a sports reporter, you know. So when I did that piece, and then not long after that, the war came. I mean, the coup happened in Gambia. It was July 22nd, 1994. It started as an ordinary day. We just heard some shots being fired. So I thought it was the exhibition, or the military were doing some exhibition. Before we knew it, was a coup was taking place.
Yahya Jammeh.
Yeah, Yahya Jammeh had taken over. So I went to State House with a colleague called Mamadou Seka, in the Gambian, and I met in front of State House. There were a lot of soldiers guarding the entrance to Jammeh's office. And when I went upstairs, I told him I wanted to talk to Jammeh for Focus on Africa. So I moved upstairs and I saw him. It was Jammeh, it was Sincate, and the two or three coup leaders that were sitting there in this place. Jammeh was very skinny. He was very skinny at the time. He wasn't really what he is now. He's the big guy. And he said, I told him to focus on Africa and the Observer. He said, oh yes, I'm going to do the interview. And then I talked to him. The first thing I asked him, and the reason I asked him this question, because I've seen this thing happen in my country, Liberia. I knew that when young people take power, they tend to forget and they tend to become embellished with what their own thinking is. And I said, are you going to be another Samuel Doe? And Jammeh looked in my eyes and he told me he will never be a dictator, that he will not be like Doe, but he will try to transform Gambia into a democratic country. And he ended up ruling Gambia for 22 years. That tells you the impact of that question, just one question I asked him, how he came back today to look at what he did.
So this is an answer to the question that Asaba asked. So Asaba, I hope that answers your question about whether Rodney focuses on stories other than in his home country of Liberia. Ibrahim Sieh asked if you think President Weah's government is sincere in fighting corruption.
We're going through the first year of Mr. Weah's government, and his speech was detailed about how he was going to fight corruption. I like to judge people on action, not words. So far, initially he did some things that showed that he was serious. Like when we did an expose on his Minister of Justice nominee, when we did that investigative report, the nomination was withdrawn. That for me was a sign that he was serious to fight corruption. But then after that, there's been a lot of things happening, about that we've been reporting about. We haven't seen a lot of action.
To be fair, he hasn't been in power for as long. But there's a question here which follows on from the previous question. So sorry for interrupting. Costin Wale asked if corruption levels are higher than under the previous administration. But clearly he's only been in power for a shorter period of time, a year. But it ties in with this issue of being sincere about fighting corruption.
It is. And remember, during the Salif administration, the former Auditor General, John Molu, I think in Ellen Salif's first or second year, he made a very controversial statement. He said, the Salif government is 3 times more corrupt than the Judy Bryant government. That was very controversial. Madam Salif was very pissed about it.
So very angry. Sorry about the expletive.
Very angry about it. And they had a extreme relationship after that. And so we is being judged in a year similar to what Salif happened to Salif in her year.
So maybe one
So I think when it's like I tell people sometimes, it's difficult. It's easy to criticize from outside, but once you get in, it becomes a different story.
I suppose at the moment people are wondering because they hear so much in the past few days about missing millions. So
Right.
this is probably sending people into wondering what's going on with regards to that, and we're still hearing about the developing story and the explanations that the government is giving. Mucha Taruwinga asked if you're an independent journalist.
Yes, I've always been independent, and that's why I'm always in trouble. Because if I'm not independent, I wouldn't have all these burdens behind me. But because people think that I'm too stubborn, I'm too arrogant, and I don't know that I'm arrogant, but I just tend to. You have to put up a faith that people can throw a distance between you and them, and that's what I try to do. I don't want to think that I'm someone who just easy to, I take my job very seriously. Bolla, sometimes I have about 2 or 3 hours sleep. I'm always on the writing. I'm always, on my paper, make sure everything is all right. I'm always investigating because there are different time zones, and I have to cater to the diaspora people where I came from, where I started from.
In America?
Yeah, they always want to hear new information, so we keep digging and digging just to please everybody. It's difficult, but we try to do it.
Another question here. Luch Jelakis says, what do you have to say about the missing millions? And the figure he quotes here is 100 million. What is the figure that you're aware of? And
I think the main 100 million US dollars, but in Liberian dollars, 16 billion. That's what.
Hence the confusion.
Right. So I think the confusion of all this is this. Initially, when they first broke, it was 9 billion Liberian dollars. And then the Minister of Information came out and said, no, it's not 9 billion, it's actually 16 billion. So that gave credence to the initial story and became an international story. So it's a very, the thing about this scandal is it keeps changing. There are several different explanations from different people in the government. That's why the public is just watching. They're not sure who to believe. And, so we keep digging and keep digging and keep digging until we find the truth. And
just in case you've just tuned in, I am about to wind up a discussion with my guest today here on our special Focus on Africa Facebook Live, and that's Rodney Sieh, who's the editor of Front Page Africa newspaper, and he's also just brought out his book Journalist on Trial. And I'm going to ask you to end with a reading, but before that, it's just a quick question here from Michael Abel, who's in South Sudan, who asked an interesting question. Is there anything the continent of Africa can learn from Liberia?
I think Liberia is a country of contradictions. In April 12, 1980, we celebrated when Doe took over. In April 14, 1979, there were riots in the street. But every time there's some kind of change, people celebrate. And this is similar in other African countries. But when liberators come to power, they often forget about the people. And that's been a recurring theme around the continent in terms of coup d'etats, in terms of civil wars. And you're seeing liberators like in Museveni was young rebel leader. Now he's been in power for years. What changed? What changed you from then to now? So I think that's been the major thing for this.
I said I was only asking one more question before asking you a reading. Whilst you get a reading, I'll just ask this question, which is on behalf of Mohammed Sharif, who's in Liberia, who says, what can journalists like you contribute to Liberia? What do you think you've contributed? And after answering the question, please give us a reading from your book.
I think, if anything, and I when I tell people this, they think I'm joking, but our investigation could have saved Liberia billions of dollars. And I say this because the Knuckles Gate scandal, the email scandal, there were a lot of concessions in those emails that Madam Salif ordered investigations for, and those concessions were cancelled. So I think the recommendations were made to her, she didn't follow up to. That's where this problem came for her. I think we've been able to go deep down into the soul of Liberian society and find those cases that matter to Liberian people.
And when you say we, you're not just talking about Front Page Africa and the probes. Are you talking about investigative journalists in Liberia as a whole?
Yes, it's not just me. There are a lot of good investigative journalists in Liberia, and I think a lot of my colleagues, they want to do good work. They want to, speak truth to power. Some of them are limited because the government controls the advertising. So some of them are afraid that if they talk too much, they won't get them advertising. And it's a very difficult line to cross. And as journalists, we just have to do what we have to do to make sure that, we change the society.
So he who pays the piper calls the tune for some journalists.
Yeah.
So Rodney, on that note, please can you give us a reading from Journalist on Trial?
I just want to go to the first chapter how I found the pen. And this is a very interesting thing for me. And it talks about my early childhood and how I started to understand what the media was all about. And it says, the chapter is called Finding the Pen. And it says, the fall of Liberia's first republic on April 12, 1980, represented an opportune time for me to fall in love with the pen. In the years before that event, my younger brother George and I had been pushed around from one relative to the next, along with my sister Yvonne, Brenda, and Beauty. An older sister, Pamela, born prior to Yvonne, had died in 1964 from pneumonia when she was only 3 years old. Lack of adequate health care was a big reason for her young death, but she was spared the tumultuous childhood that was to play out for the rest of us. Yvonne, who had been in the first grade at the time of Pamela's death, recalls a very young girl who amazed everyone with her fondness for going under the dining room table and lifting it up with her head. Our Uncle Keith nicknamed her Hercules.
Thank you very much. And your book is now out.
Yep.
Published
on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, bookstores around.
Barnes & Nobles are the publishers, so people can get hold of it. Is it available in Liberia?
I'm going to do a launch in Liberia December 20th at Bella Casa Hotel. I'm doing a series of events in London. I'm going to America, and I'm going to Canada. It's a long stretch for me in the next few weeks and months.
And in the meantime, you're still going to be editing Front Page Africa remotely, I think.
I multitask.
Rodney, thank you very, very much. And for all of you who've sent questions to Rodney, perhaps you want to wave. I think that's the camera they can see you on. So all of you, thank you very much for joining
Hello, Liberia.
Here on, and the rest of the continent, actually. Thank you very much for sharing your questions with us and for joining us here. And I'm sure you can still